if you're going into an interview with Palantir, you should be aware of some peculiar interview questions. The first one being, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? And this is quite a famous question at Palantir. It's also called the Peter Thiel interview question because he mentioned it in the first chapter of his book 0 to 1. Now, to understand how to best answer this question, let's read a little bit between the lines. First, this is a behavioral interview question because it asks you about your past experiences in a bit to use that as a predictor of success in your future role. Second, whenever you're getting asked a behavioral interview question, there must be a behavior or a reason involved in this case. For example, we could also reframe this interview question of what important truth do very few people agree with you on with, tell me about the time when you had a major disagreement with someone. All right. Furthermore, this interview question is framed rather counterintuitively. It's even an open-ended type of interview question. It's a generic question, and you may not be aware that in a job interview, the best types of stories come from your professional expertise. So the way this question is framed right now, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? Many candidates will be tempted to answer with a personal experience, whereas in job interviews, the best way to sell yourself as a candidate would be with stories from your professional expertise. All right, so up until now, we know that they're basically asking you, tell me about a disagreement with someone on your team, with someone in a professional context. Could be a disagreement with your manager, could be with a peer, could be with a client, or with another type of stakeholder. Now that we understand what this question is all about, it's a pretty standard, one of the most commonly asked behavioral interview questions. The best way to answer these questions is using a functional type of conflict. A functional type of conflict simply means a conflict around your subject matter expertise. If you're a software engineer, a conflict qualifies maybe over an algorithm with one of your colleagues, or a conflict with your manager around a deadline, right? Or a conflict with a customer around some ambiguous customer requirements. How do you resolve that conflict? Two things. First, you come up with the data or with the proof, so to speak, and the second, you communicate that efficiently in a bid to regain their trust, right? The second interview question I'd like you to consider here would be, tell me about a project you worked on that you absolutely did not enjoy. Why did you dislike it and how did you push through? Again, this is a behavioral interview question. And if we look a little bit, if we read a little bit between the lines of why the question gets asked, you'll understand this is about a stressful situation, right? You could easily prove your point that you did not enjoy on something because it was extremely stressful. It's normal that you don't like too much working under stress, right? What are some examples of answers? Well, maybe you worked over hours because there was a deadline, a critically important deadline involved, or maybe you had to work with a difficult customer, in which situation you had to over communicate to them. Maybe they had an unreasonable request that was very hard to explain to them, or maybe some clients are not easy to satisfy, right? So basically, the best way to answer this interview question, even if it's framed like what you absolutely did not enjoy to work on, you would talk about a challenging situation, a challenging delivery. So the better the delivery happened, ultimately, the better your story will qualify as a great one, right? Your ability to deliver in job interviews is the main thing with any high-performing company, right? The third interview question I'd like to share with you here would be, tell me about the time when you had to make a high-impact decision with incomplete data. How did you decide and what was the outcome? Okay, so the core reason why someone would ask you this in a job interview is because they want to see how you deal with ambiguous situations, right? Incomplete data, ambiguity. Okay, data-driven decision-making is a major inflection point in job interviews. Again, to remind you, in any job interview with a high-performing company, your first preference would be for a story from a professional context, also ideally using your subject matter expertise. So what's the best way to answer these types of questions of dealing with ambiguous client requests, for example? Well, you use your expertise, your previous experience, in a context to disambiguate the situation. Or maybe that particular ambiguity required you to seek for additional expertise or assistance from someone else. You had to learn something new. Or maybe, it was simply about gathering the data, using some critical thinking skills, and it was all about that data-driven decision-making process you used to disambiguate that ambiguous client request. Right? My suggestion would be to stay truthful, especially in a behavioral interview, because in high-performing companies, this is the first thing they will be screening you on, even before the quality of your stories. Question number 4. Tell me about the time when you built a tool or delivered a project, program, or solution, and the end users completely hated it, ignored it, or refused to use it. How did you figure out why, and what did you change? Okay, so you'll notice this is a question framed counterintuitively on purpose, simply because behavioral interview questions are quite easy to predict in job interviews, and they must, up their game, so to speak, on these things. So what is behind this interview question? This is about your ability to influence and about your listening skills. Now, what influence means to your role might completely differ from other roles. For example, for a principal PM or an executive to influence, for example, you bring in a new tool inside the organization and nobody likes it, nobody adopts it. How do you influence them to adopt it? Well, you team up with some other 10 executives and you convince them to pilot that tool with their own teams. So then those teams have basically little choice than to adopt it, at least temporarily. So this is how you would influence as an executive, right? Now, for not so senior types of roles, such as for a forward deployed software or engineer, influencing happens rather with less authority, right? So maybe influencing means going on site, on the factory floor, so to speak, with a customer to ensure you understand the requirements as good as possible, to ensure that their workflow will be as smooth as possible using the new tool. And of course, ideally this new tool would simplify their life, right? So building listening skills would be the way, listening to the customer, and of course also building your listening skills would be key to sell yourself as a great candidate that, helps in driving adoption with, clients who completely hate or ignored or refuse to use or your project, program, or solution, or simply a tool here, right? And finally, the 5th interview question I want to share with you here would be, tell me about the decision you took without consulting your manager. And in my experience, many of the people applying for Palantir's jobs are with experience from the military, and I would understand why you'd have a problem answering these types of questions. But again, these are behavioral interview questions, and you must understand the core reason behind the interview question. And the core reason behind this question of a decision you took without consulting your manager would be a bias for action type of situation. So in other words, you didn't have time to consult with your manager. It's not as if you did not want to consult with them. And once you understand why the question gets asked, the bias for action and speed, you would understand that maybe, that decision wasn't as critically important as it might appear, so consulting your boss wasn't a critical requirement anyway. An example of a non-critical decision would be when you have to give an estimation over a project. You speak with the client, hey, you have to make an estimation, hey, how long will this implementation take? You take, hey, I think it's going to take 2 months. You don't have the time. You don't have the time to thoroughly consult with everyone, because they only need it as an idea, right? Not as a definite decision on something critically important, right? So long story short, although these questions can be framed rather counterintuitively, I would highly suggest that you try to interview with confidence and try to sell yourself on your best stories. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.